Hey everyone, welcome. I see we are rolling in. We'll give it a minute or so while everybody starts joining and going from there. It is, as always, a pleasure having you and very, very keen to share a little bit of time with you guys as well. So from our side, welcome to this session of the Speakers Forge and our meeting of the minds. We are so happy to have you and to spend a little bit of lunchtime with you and hopefully learn quite a lot today. This session is focused around data protection, the things you didn't know you need to know from Ross Sanders, an absolutely incredible internationally acclaimed speaker, and he's on more panels and certifications than you can count. He's absolutely brilliant. It's going to be a really interesting session from that. And we'll also be hearing from Mandla all about Rust and why he loves Rust. He is a senior developer in our space and really is one of the more esoteric language focused friends and quite enjoys working with them as well. I'll be here just to field some questions. So as always, you are welcome to leave a question in the chat or in the QA section. We'll be fielding them after each talk and replying to comments throughout. The session is recorded and it will be released on our YouTube channel in a little bit. So keep your eyes out for that. In the meantime, we're going to have a lot of fun, and without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Ross. Ross, welcome. Thank you so much for spending some time with us. I'm going to turn off my camera now.
Cool, thanks for having me. It's good to see all the folks signing in here. I'm quite excited to be here. And yeah, we're going to talk about some interesting aspects today around privacy, around security, how the two sort of interplay with one another. I just want to see if everyone can see me comfortably. Someone give a thumbs up there. I'm going to pop over in here. Right.
That's perfect.
Fantastic. Cool. So we're going to go into this. I generally know how people sort of feel when we talk about privacy in particular and POPI. I think we've all had a bit of POPI fatigue at the moment as to the amount of information that is out there and fear-mongering and all of this. And I'm going to try and keep this that I don't give you guys a bit of a death by PowerPoint, because that is by far not what I want to do. So I want to take us through some privacy stuff, take us through some security stuff. And then, like Anine said, we'll have some questions at the end of it. But I want to dive in with probably the most death by PowerPoint part of this. And I want to take us through a couple of definitions about security, privacy, that side of things, because we're dealing with a whole bunch of information now that we haven't necessarily been dealing with in the past. And it's adding a whole lot more requirements on folks from all sides of the business. So it can be from the development side, it can be from the consulting side, it can be from DevOps. There's a whole bunch of stuff that comes into this now as to how we are responsible with data. So let's talk about personal information. Now, this is quite broad. I'm not using the definition from POPI here for the reasoning that POPI's definition is quite large, it's quite long, it's quite broad. And the Australian Act really does summarize personal information quite well. So I've taken this from the Australian Privacy Act. So personal information is information or an opinion, including information or an opinion forming part of a database, whether true or not, whether recorded in a material form or not, about an individual whose identity is apparent or can reasonably be ascertained from the information or opinion. The key thing here that we need to be aware of when we're doing any sort of work in databases or anything like that is this component here that says information that about an individual whose identity is apparent or can reasonably be ascertained. It's very easy to say that personal information is a name, a surname, an ID number, that kind of stuff, and that's personally identifiable information. That's great. But it goes broader than this because you get related information in this space as well. So if you have a name and a phone number in this table, and you've got a phone number and an email address in that table, and an email and a surname in the other table with perhaps a job title or something like that, that key relationship that you have through everything means that the entire set is personal information. So as soon as there's some sort of profile that can be built or where people can start ascertaining your identity, it's all personal information. So we need to be aware of that. Right, the next thing I want to get into is data privacy, because we talk about privacy, we talk about information security, data protection. There are all these terms going around. What do they actually mean? And one of the things we come across a lot is that data privacy, information security gets used interchangeably when they are actually quite different. So data privacy, it is not the IT department's problem. It is not just compliance's problem. Privacy is broad. And if we look at the definition of it, we're talking about the relationship between the collection and dissemination of data. I mean, that's easy. That's where the data comes in, how we share it, things like that. We talk about technology, where the data is stored. Is it stored in a database, flat files, things like that? Can even be physical storage as well, paperwork, boxes that are stored at Metrofile, that kind of thing. Then we start talking about the public expectation of privacy and the legal and political issues surrounding them. These are far from just compliance or just IT's problem. This starts talking to public relations, it's marketing, it's how we deal with different stakeholders in a company. It's very, very broad. It's that public expectation too. So I engage with you guys. I expect you're not going to sell my information to someone. Legal and political issues, you do sell my information or something like that, I have a recourse where I can come after a civil action or approach a regulator or something like that. So you have this very broad space that really touches every single side of a business, whether it's development, whether it's reception, whether it's boardrooms, across the board, it's there. Contrast this with information security. Now, this is a definition that requires me to take a bit of a breath. And I don't know why academics can't use more punctuation, but information security refers to the processes and methodologies which are designed and implemented to protect print, electronic, or any other form of confidential, private, and sensitive information or data from unauthorized access, use, misuse, disclosure, destruction, modification, or disruption. Quite a mouthful. This here is a lot more aligned with the IT teams, with security teams, that kind of thing. So there's that wedge kind of between data privacy and information security. Data privacy, we're talking about collection, movement, that side of thing. InfoSec, we're talking about protecting all of that together. How do we prevent unauthorized access? How do we stop stuff from being misused? What sort of access control do we have? How do we stop stuff from being deleted? So privacy is broad. We've got these legal recourses for things like information security getting breached. And it's important, this last little bit of this, talking about unauthorized access, use, misuse, disclosure, destruction, modification, disruption. A breach is broader than just a hacker coming along, getting access to something and exfiltrating data. It's if you accidentally delete something. So if someone does the whole Fable drop table kind of thing, and you drop a table and you can't get that information back, there's no backups, you've technically had a data breach. So very, very important to realize that breaches and the description of a breach can be a lot broader. Now, I brought up the term of data protection when I was first talking about this. If you want to visualize this as to how we start talking in this space, think of data protection as this umbrella term. So data protection is the umbrella. Underneath it, you've got your privacy and your information security. And then underneath information security, you've got things like cybersecurity, physical security, things like that. So you've got this cascade effect down of all these different security aspects and protection aspects. So that's what we're going to discuss a bit on today, moving through some privacy, moving through some security, but let's get into a bit of an example of something that can happen, just to kind of bring this in as to what kind of things can go on. So one of the situations that I got to assist in, which was a breach for all intents and purposes. We'll call it an incident for now, because there are very big differences between calling something an incident and a breach. But what happened was working with a system where it was a software provider had designed a system for use with things like clubs and associations and things like that. And part of the system is the executive teams of the clubs could log in and send SMSs to members and things like that. And it was this SMS gateway built into the system. Now, all of a sudden one day, the guys that were hosting the system and that had developed it noticed that, there's a lot of SMS traffic going out of this instance. And it turned out that in a period of an hour or something, about 14,000 SMSs had been sent for an association with like 30 members. So definitely not what was expected to be happening. And they had to log in, take a look around, get the logs, and someone had indeed got into the system and they were just firing off these notifications at a rate of knots. And it was this dodgy investment company somewhere in Joburg South that was sending the stuff out, send us 200 Rand and blah, blah, blah. So definitely wasn't coming out of the system. But there weren't open APIs or anything like that to be doing this. So it was a bit of a mission. And one of the accounts had been compromised. One of the executive accounts had been compromised. But there's the investigation as to how did this happen? What sort of thing could cause this compromise? And the immediate thought for all of this was that someone had brute forced or used rainbow tables or something like that. And the association that had the system was jumping up and down that the system was insecure and it was a disaster and blah, blah, blah. And the developers had to sort this out immediately. And it got a little bit ugly, but we'll get to that in a moment. And the thought was brute forcing, things like that. This wasn't, this was someone that had hacked in and it was due to the fact that the developers hadn't put sufficient security in and blah, 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 blah. But after a lot of looking and realizing that, there were safeguards built in, there was a lockout if the wrong password was entered 5 times. So it couldn't have been brute forcing because unless they were really lucky and the password was one of the first 5 you tried, it wasn't going to be that. Then it was a case of, was the database compromised? And it was investigations into that. And what eventually came out at the end of the day was that one of the members in this executive team of the association had gone and sold their credentials to this dodgy place, and they'd made a couple of bucks, and the other place had sent out all these SMSs, and it was very ugly from there. So it was, in the end, an insider threat. So there was unauthorized access, there was unauthorized use, and this was a couple of years ago now, before Poppy was in place, and we'll get to that in a moment. But there were significant costs involved with this. Outside, even though it wasn't the fault of the development house, there were costs that came into this from a security perspective. Now, the costs ranged in various ways. The first cost was a cost in time. There was the time taken to investigate this stuff. You had to pull databases, you had to pull logs, audit logs, go through everything. Where did access take place? Who accessed what? Did they get to the membership information? It was a whole big investigation that came through. And it was about 2 weeks of work that were burnt on investigating this incident that caused all of this. So that's a big cost in terms of salaries, in terms of production, things like that. That was quite hectic. Then there's the costs that come like part and parcel with the investigation. Because there was this massive risk around the data and things like that, and there were threats of suing and all sorts of stuff. We'll get to that in a moment. The company had to go and get legal advice and things like that. And the cost of investigating this outside of looking at the database, but getting in infrastructure specialists and security specialists and legal advice, you're suddenly looking at 50 grand a day for working on this whole investigation. And that lasted for like 2-3 days with those players involved as well with legal. So it got very, very expensive there too. And then the last thing, which is also something that happens with a lot of breaches, is the drama that followed it. So with this whole situation, the association got highly aggressive about this with the dev house. And it really, it got the backs up of everyone at the dev house, and then there was aggression back, and it got into a very, very ugly he said, she said kind of thing between the two of them. And it really spoiled the relationship, where there were a whole bunch of assumptions made and things like that. But what I want to bring in here is you need to cooperate if an incident does happen. But this got really, really ugly. There were accusations of why wasn't there multi-factor authentication on things before they found out that it was the person that actually sold the credentials. So it got bad. The relationship was spoiled from there. And eventually, like, that association went their own way without the software anymore. And it wasn't really a fault of the software house at all. It was just these incidents happening and different protections that could or should or would have been put in place to stop this kind of stuff. Now, this is all kind of, and I've spoken about civil action and wanting to sue and all that. That's stuff that can still happen. But now what we have, and if this incident had to happen now, we also have the likes of POPI and GDPR. Now, POPI is Protection of Personal Information Act, which everyone would probably be sick to death of now because of all the emails you've received this month asking you to opt out, opt in, and everything in between. GDPR is Europe's equivalent. It's the General Data Protection Regulation. Now, where these two come from is they're built from the OECD guidelines, which were designed in the 80s, and they've been updated since then, just on how data can be transferred between companies, countries, things like that. And it comes down to a number of principles. Now, GDPR has got new principles in place and conditions, and it's updated for the cloud and where we are now. POPI is still a little bit older. It was designed in 2013. We don't necessarily have the breakdowns for the cloud and all of that in it, but the two are relatively similar. And because they're similar, our regulator in South Africa has said they're going to look to Europe for guidance on privacy. So we can look at these principles and take solace in that we can follow GDPR principles as well as POPI principles, and we'll still be overlapping, which is great. It's not to say that if you're compliant with POPI, you're totally compliant with GDPR or vice versa. There are little bits in between, but at least they're similar. So I want to take you through the principles of POPI, because they do affect us in a dev sense, and how we're looking at things as a company when we're looking at information and personal information. So just as a quick run through here, what we talk about here is accountability. This is that companies are going to be accountable for the information that they hold, be it personal information or anything like that. And it's also about personal information of individuals, but information of companies as well. So if you're looking after databases, things like that, if you're storing just company information, don't make the mistake of thinking this isn't seen as personal. Under POPI, it is. So very much something to be aware of. Then we talk about the three that we've been bombarded with, which is these opt-in notices and changes to privacy policies that we've seen. It's processing limitation, purpose specification, and further limitation. Now, when we're talking about these, processing limitation is talking about only taking the information you need. Now, this ties into dev quite a bit, because when you're starting to spec stuff out, you need to start speccing to take it as the minimum amount of info you're looking for, not the maximum. We've looked at it in the past where it's like, let's take all the information we can just in case, then we don't have to go back for it. POPI kind of changes that. You need to be aware of what you need the information for. So purpose specification, specify that purpose. And when you're speccing it out, only take the information that you need. That talks to processing limitation. The other side of processing limitation is the legal basis for processing. And this is where you see everyone throwing their hands in the air for consent and what have you. There are a number of ways to process information. Consent is only one of them. Most likely in your space, if you've been contracted to develop some software or something like that, you would be working under contract, not consent. So in order to deliver this product to you, we have to have this kind of information, and this is in the contract that we work this way. That way, consent doesn't come into it. So beware there. A lot of people think POPI is only about consent. It's not. Right, so processing limitation, taking only what you need. Purpose specification, knowing what you need it for. So your specs are coming in big time here. And then further limitation. This is where you need to be careful as well, because what further limitation says is if you do have XYZ information and you've collected it for ABC purpose, you can't go and use that information for DEF purpose or some other route that you want to do. That's where that sharing of information to other companies and stuff comes into POPI in a big way now. So these three tie in together. It's generally where you would see privacy policies updated and things like that. And if you are doing sort of full SaaS solutions and things like that, these three are where you're going to define the responsibilities. Is a client responsible for managing passwords, or are you responsible for managing passwords? And you need to define those kind of relationships. So even though you're doing the dev work, you're doing the speccing and things like that, there needs to be some sort of view into the POPI space, because you have to be open about that now and tell people about this. Right, we will hit on that in a little bit as well, data privacy impact assessments. But the next part that we look at here is information quality. This is having up-to-date information. This is where it's good to not be working off copies of copies of copies of information, as we tend to do. And we're seeing a big drive. I'm seeing it in the USA quite a bit, where it is access, not copies, for information, which means there's a single source. It's a single source that can be kept up to date, and you can access it from different systems and things like that and do what you need to do without making a copy of it. That speaks very nicely to the information quality space here, because you want that information to be up to date, to be clear, things like that. We've seen a number of companies that have fallen foul of this, particularly with wanting to get opt-in consent and stuff, where they've sent out this mailer to everyone saying, please opt in, but the mailer has been sent to an old database and people have already opted out, and then they complain, and then there's fines involved. It's really not somewhere you want to be. So having good up-to-date information is great as far as POPI is concerned. Then we speak about openness. This is being open and honest about what we're doing with data. If you can't be open and honest about data, generally you're either in a space of having legal action happening, or you shouldn't have that data in the first place. So you need to be able to be open about the information and that side of things. Then we need to have security safeguards. This is what we're going to spend quite a bit of time on in a little while. This is putting in security around software, around information, where we've got databases. How are we protecting that? Safeguards are a vital thing, and safeguards range from a lock on a door right the way through to like massive amounts of encryption and all sorts of high-tech stuff. So security safeguards, very big range, but is massively important while we're at the design phases, because you want to make sure that you've got that security taken into account while you're working on this stuff. Right, then lastly on the principles, we have subject participation. Subject participation is people can request that information is removed. Now, this is an important thing to realize, particularly if you're doing any sort of like software as a service hosting or something like that. You can land yourself in trouble on subject participation. This is where people have the right to be forgotten and all of these good things that we hear about, where I don't want you to have my information, please remove it, and everyone must expunge the info they've got. These are called data subject access requests. And the key part to it is request. So someone can request their information's removed, but there are a whole bunch of caveats there. You can't just delete information. You can cause a breach like that. If you are a software as a service provider, you're providing these services, say you're doing business to business, and then you're servicing the employees at the end of the day, the business that has bought your software needs to give the orders around deleting things like that. They are the responsible party, not you. So if you do get these kind of requests around subject participation, be sure what the relationship is like. See about whether you need to act on this or whether your client in a business-to-business relationship needs to react on it. But subject participation, big thing. We're seeing a lot of that nowadays, and it is a dev consideration as well. If someone does want information deleted, can you facilitate that deletion request? Can you go in and remove this information that they want removed? Sometimes this can be really challenging, particularly in large, complex databases. How do you relate all of that stuff? You can break a database by removing certain information and keys. It's something you need to consider as you go through. Right, so that was a whirlwind on these conditions. They are a blessing and a curse together. A blessing in that you can define what your compliance is with these. A curse in that you don't get a checklist of what to do to comply. So there is no such thing of, give me the 10 things I need to do to get POPI compliant. Doesn't happen that way. It's really a conditional approach that's going to be case by case, company by company that you need to look at. Cool. Now, in this space as well, we have different types of information. Not all information is treated equally. And what you need to be aware of is when certain types of information are coming into the system you're designing. So what we have in terms of GDPR, POPI is something called special personal information. Now, this is information that can be or has been used to discriminate against people generally. So we're talking about your religious and philosophical beliefs. We're talking about your race and ethnic origin, trade union memberships, political party affiliation, your health, sex life, medical information, biometric information, and that in terms of criminal record information as well. These are special bits of information. Under these acts, there are different ways of processing this information. Generally, you would need additional consent to make use of this information. So important to know if you've got a relationship, you're building medical software or something like that, or software that tracks BEE compliance, you want to know that the data you're working on is legally obtained and that there's consent behind it, or that there is a law requiring this data to be processed. That's where a lot of this special personal information comes in. Now, what I want to push on with this part is what GDPR tells us. So GDPR, particularly if you've got European clients, GDPR does apply to you, but GDPR talks about doing a data privacy impact assessment, DPIA, or data protection impact assessment. And part of when you need to do a DPIA is when you're processing any of this kind of information that we've got here. And it's an analysis of the privacy side of things. There was a poll that went out talking about privacy by design. DPIA is privacy by design in action. It's doing this analysis when you're doing the development and things like that around what are the risks and things like that. So if you are processing really sensitive information, or you're processing large scales of public information, publicly accessible information, so like scraping and stuff like that, you need to do a DPIA. Now, within a DPIA, there are a number of things you need to look out for. So you need to consider sort of a description of what your processing is going to be. So in your specs and things like that, what is this project going to do? What is this thing going to do? Describe that. Next, you need to talk about the type of information you're going to take. What are the purposes behind the information? How are we processing it? What are the risks in this place? Are we going to be sort of targeted with anything that we need to look out for? Where could a breach happen in this? That's what we want to analyze in this DPIA. Next, we want to look at our legal reason for doing this. Now, if you are being contracted by a client to do stuff, this would generally be their side. They would have to define that they've done the right legal stuff, but it's important for you to know that this needs to be analyzed. So if they are collecting information, have they collected it legally? And are they using something called legitimate interest? Now, legitimate interest is a conversation all on its own, but it's if you're using information, personal information, you don't have consent for it, you don't have a contract for it, there's no legal reason you should be processing it, you're defining why you want to process it. That's where you've got to do a big justification in your DPIA at this point. So following on from that, when you've got this legitimate interest, you've got to specify what is the proportion of data that you're going to be looking at. How much data are you taking for this development? Be aware of that kind of stuff. The more data you have, the higher your risk is going to be. Then you need to look at what is the effect that this data could have. How sensitive is this data? Is it highly sensitive kind of stuff? What are the risks there? What is our justification for taking this information? We need to look at the materiality, how sensitive it is, and the extent, how much it is. So very, very important to bring in there. And then we need to look at what our risks and controls are in the space. So if there are these risks to privacy, what controls are we putting in place to secure it? Yes, we've got a sensitive piece of information we're going to store in the database. You know what? Let's encrypt that field in the database. And that's one of our protections. That's the kind of stuff we need to be looking at. So what are some of the effects that we're looking at from a security point of view in dev? Now that I've given a crash course on the privacy side of things and privacy by design and impact assessments, what are some key things that you need to be looking out from a dev perspective? Well, does it affect you? First of all, I hope everyone is giving the resounding answer of yes now. It definitely does on all ends. But what are some of the key things that you might not be aware of? One thing we need to look at is things like info and debug logs. For one, you want to have the differentiation of levels. So if your standard logging is going out as just info, then there really shouldn't be anything sensitive in there. Please don't put sensitive or identifiable data in there or confidential data in there or anything like that. Info logs should be info. When you're getting to the debug side, by all means, have that able to be enabled. And sure, perhaps in debug, you need to have some personal information in there or confidential information or sensitive information. It's all about the data here. But have it that it's only there for debug, and be sure to turn debug off. If anyone is in the support space here, the DevOps space, and you're using this regularly, please turn debug off when you're done. And make sure you're not leaving logs with sensitive information in them lying around on servers or anything like that. Very, very important. Then another thing to consider is things called toxic data and toxic inputs. So, you know, we've considered for a long time in development that you've got to sanitize inputs and things like that because someone can do SQL injection, and that is still a very real risk. It's one of the main things that folks do is SQL injection in fields. So you've got to know what's coming in. If someone's able to just sort of comment out the SQL within a text box, that's going to be very, very dangerous for you. That's toxic data coming into those inputs, but you have toxic data that can come into open text fields as well, which is something to be aware of, particularly, again, if you're hosting some sort of software as a service space. Because if you are obtaining info, you will often find that people will decide, oh, well, I need to give extra information for this. Think of it of like a ticketing system or something like that. There's a description field. Someone is going to, at some point, put an ID number or a credit card or something like that into the wrong field. And that's where we start getting this toxic data. And where we can, a good security measure is to try and cater for that kind of thing coming in. If you know you're dealing with credit card information and things like that, you can actually do checks for what could be a credit card number in a broad field and things like that, and address that. There are other systems out there that can look for this as well, but it's something to be very, very aware of, particularly if you're going to look at something like database anonymization or cleaning a database so that you can use it internally and saying that it's de-identified. De-identification, if you only do name and contact detail fields, is only so good as what's in these description fields, because if you can re-identify someone from a description field, then you've got a major problem with your anonymization and your de-identification. So something to be very, very aware of there. The next thing I want to bring up is something about how we set up our environments that we're doing dev on and things like that. And a particular favorite of mine has been MySQL over the years. So using things like default credentials can be dangerous. One of the things I try and do whenever I'm dealing with a company as a new client kind of thing, because I do the sort of bridge between privacy and security, is I love hopping onto guest Wi-Fis. I don't think we should ever have guest Wi-Fis anymore. Hop onto the guest Wi-Fi, do a quick port scan of the network, see where SQL is sitting on the network, because a lot of places don't segregate Wi-Fi for guests from main network. Find the dev machines, hop on, try different root credentials that would be default, and man, can you get into a lot of databases in a dev office by doing things this way. So default credentials, even when you're in office doing your development, if you're working on like LAMP stacks that are quick to set up and things like that, go through and make sure you're not using these default database credentials and things like that, because it's really easy to forget about that. And folks can gain access, pull a SQL dump out to something. They can do it from a guest Wi-Fi. That means they don't have to be in the building either. They can stand in the parking lot if they've got access to the guest Wi-Fi and pull data from inside the building. So be aware of that kind of stuff. It's a breach is always a perfect storm of different events happening that seem unrelated, and then it all comes crashing down. Right, then other things to look at. Sensitive storage in the dev space. If you're storing sensitive information, things like passwords or things like deeply personal information, or you know that you've got a client that wants to store sensitive stuff in a database or something, start looking at your different options for encryption. If you're using hashing and things like that, use salts with them, use peppers with them, things like that. So that you don't have these risks from sensitive data being exposed. So talking about the password space, hashing a password, by all means hash a password, but there are attacks called rainbow tables where people have taken tables and tables of hashed values and they've mapped them out. So if someone gets hold of a database that's hashed and it's not necessarily salted, they can try and work out passwords from there. It's really easy to do. If you salt it, you add an additional piece to that hash, then you have a different story. Rainbow tables can't attack that very well because the hashes have changed now according to what your salt is. So very important to look at that kind of stuff if you're storing passwords. I still see modern places using just a hash on passwords, which is a very, very dangerous approach to have. That's where a lot of breaches have happened, a lot of fines have happened. On the SQL side, talking about tables and things like that, know the differences between what types of encryption you would use in different circumstances. So where do you use a table encryption? Where do you use field encryption? Where do you use transparent encryption across the database? And if you're exporting databases and dumping them, are the files encrypted as well? If you've got sensitive data, please make sure you're doing that. Some other stuff we see, hard coding of credentials. Again, we all get taught this in college. Don't hard code credentials and stuff into code. But it still happens constantly. And folks are trawling GitHub and the like over and over, trying to find where credentials have been stored. So don't keep those credentials in code. If you are going to do it, have some additional security on it. Encrypt the stuff before it's put in code. Make it that someone can't decrypt it in that code or comb through the code to get that. It's very, very important. Then next one, DevTest prod. Man, the amount of times that tests and systems get breached. Your dev environment, your test environment is simply an extension of the prod environment. If you have these different environments in place, you need to ensure that dev and test are secured in exactly the same manner as production, because it really doesn't help you if you're mirroring prod down to test every evening or every week or something like that, and your test environment has very weak security. So you're not using a actual certificate signed by a CA. You are perhaps not putting all your hardening on the server, things like that, because it's just dev, it's just test. No, that's how people get hacked. It's the same as backups and things like that. Attackers are smart. They are organized. Chances are they're not going to go for production. They're going to go for backups, for test environments, things like that, because it's easy pickings, because people forget to secure them. It's very important to be aware of that. And then lastly on this space, talking about security, if you're doing any sort of web development, please look at OWASP Top 10 and things like OWASP ZAP. So these are basically penetration testing. Well, ZAP is penetration testing that you can run on your systems, run automated tests, see where your gaps are. Very, very important to do that. The OWASP Top 10 are the top 10 things you need to address in development to make sure you are doing things correctly. So things like cross-site scripting, like your SQL injections and things like that. You want to really be making sure you're following this OWASP side of things to cover those major bases when you're doing this development. Right, so bit of a whirlwind there on what these were. I want to talk to us quickly about what are the consequences of Poppy and these kind of breaches, because we can't look at them in isolation anymore. The privacy laws are here to stay, and they affect our security side. So major consequence that everyone has heard about is fines. In the media, we're seeing all of these things about, you're going to get a 10 million Rand fine. You're not going to get a 10 million Rand fine straight off the bat. You're going to get a case-by-case investigation. What went wrong? What situation caused this? How many pieces of data were lost? What was the extent of the data? Then there will be a decision on the fine, and it's the sliding scale. The more you've done to protect things, the lower that sliding scale is going to be. The more you've totally ignored privacy legislation and the regulator, that fine's going to balloon up from there. So important to be aware of, there are fines. It's not the be all and end all. What happens from this as well is what I mentioned from that little example. People will be very unhappy when data goes missing. The fine is not the only thing in isolation that you have to be worried about. You can get sued for this stuff as well. Poppy gives people the right to civil action as well as going to the regulator. So it's vital that you're aware that security really does affect you. Even if Poppy is not affecting you, you can breach NDAs, you can breach data processing agreements, you can be sued by your client if they have a breach, depending on how your agreements are working. So very, very important to be aware of those agreements and what your responsibilities are. And then lastly, though we probably won't see too much of this unless you really ignore the regulator when they tell you what to do, there are criminal penalties under Poppy where there can be criminal penalties levied against directors and information officers if things go wrong. But this is a case of you have to have things really go wrong. You have to have ignored any sort of notices the regulator gives you. You're going to have ignored security and things like that. Then this will come in. But most likely you're looking at fines, you're looking at civil action, you're looking at reputational damage, that side of things, which you don't want either. That can wreck you as much as a fine can. And you want to look out for that. So what are some of the quick wins that we can do in this place? Well, first one, if you are regularly processing sensitive information, or you're going to process sensitive information, work with your clients. If it's internal and in-house, then you must do this, please. Do those data privacy impact assessments. Do a short assessment of 2 pages. Have a form built in something that says, this is the process we're going to do. This is the kind of information we're looking after. This is the kind of safeguards we should look at to put in place. What's our risks? What's our controls? Build that into the SDLC. It works really, really well for having all these ducks in a row when something goes wrong. You can say, well, we did do an assessment and so on. So build DPIAs into the spec process. The next thing you should do is map out where data is stored. Do you have multiple copies? Should we have single copies? Map out your data, know where it's going to be, know what's sensitive so that you can protect the sensitive stuff, and really just be aware of those different aspects that you need to look out for. Also look for, if you're constantly working on SQL databases that perhaps clients supply to you, make sure they're stored securely somewhere. Don't just leave copies of these SQL dumps all over the show. Make sure you are storing those safely. If you've got a NAS, encrypt it, put all the stuff there, central location, really, really helps. Then, while you're designing this stuff, consider that folks are going to try and break into systems. We're seeing so much more stuff around third-party attacks where the likes of a bank is not getting attacked because they've got red team, blue team, purple team, and all sorts of stuff happening there for security. But there are external service providers, third-party providers to the bank. Let's go after the third-party provider. They might not have the same security. So there is this move where attacks are happening now to third-party dev houses and things like that, instead of the main target, which is the client. So you can extract that. We've seen this breach in South Africa before, where bank information was breached via SMS gateways and things like that. Very, very important. And then lastly, secure, secure, secure. Half of this is in the code, half of this is in the config. We see so many breaches, about a quarter of breaches globally in 2020 were caused due to configuration issues and ports being opened. The amount of times I see SQL, RDP, and SSH open on servers is astounding. You must secure those ports, secure your environments, but then secure your code as well. So looking at things like penetration testing, vulnerability assessment, have we got the correct firewall rules in place? We need to work together. We're seeing DevOps being more DevSecOps now, working in the security space. We need to all work together for this. So it really helps all of us from all ends work together for this privacy side. Right, so I think I've given you a whirlwind side now. I'm going to, I think, hand back over to Anine, and then let's see if there's any questions.
All right, fantastic. We actually do have two questions. So as a start, Hendrik has asked, have you seen cases around POPI and GDPR breaches in our legal system, especially around if I ask company A to move my data, they refuse based on reasons that are not, you know, quote unquote valid, etc. Have you seen anything like this?
We haven't seen anything go to court or anything yet. I know for a fact there have been loads of complaints logged. So the regulator is operating. Their email addresses are working and they are taking names, basically. We haven't seen any action from it yet. I think that, I mean, we are, what, 28 days in to POPI now, 29 days into POPI. So I think they're still catching up at the moment. But I think you can rest assured we're going to see action very, very soon. And places are refusing to remove information, sometimes very validly, because it can be a fraud case where someone's saying, oh, I've committed fraud. You remove my info. And then you remove that and you remove the evidence. So companies are declining and things like that.
It's an interesting discussion, and I think a lot of POPI interactions are going to be settled in court. So we'll keep our eyes out for that. And then Jeff also asked, without a list, how is compliance then determined fairly? How do you know if you are compliant?
So that's where those principles come in. So you've got that accountability, purpose specification, processing limitation, all of those. Within that space, you need to provide a body of evidence, basically. So like for accountability, for example, that speaks to your policies that you have. If you've got IT security policies, data protection policies, it's the paperwork side. Then talking to security safeguards, do you have alarm systems? Do you have firewalls? So I think compliant is a misnomer in that this is a journey. It's not a destination. You'll never be 100% compliant with POPI. The second a business process changes, your compliance changes. So it's actually about doing the right thing and doing good business. That's actually all data protection is.
Absolutely. That's a fantastic answer. Thank you. And for those who may be interested in upskilling and knowing more about how to do this and just read a bit more, where would you recommend we delve in and start reading?
There are a number of places where you can get a lot of good info. Things that come to mind. So for one, if you want to find out about POPI, our regulator is actually really, really active on Twitter. So follow the information regulator on Twitter and you'll get actually quite a bit of guidance notes and stuff like that. When it comes to privacy as a whole globally, go look at the ICO. It's the Information Commissioner's Office in the UK. So ico.org.uk. They have loads of information around privacy, what you should be doing, what they look for. It's a great resource. Also, the IAPP, International Association of Privacy Professionals, they've got loads of resources available there. And from an InfoSec point of view, look at the InfoSec Institute. So they have fantastic programs that you can sign up for. And it's courses and courses. It's like a Udemy on steroids for all these certifications and things like that. So I highly recommend them.
That's amazing. Okay, one last question before we wrap up. Gilad wanted to know, when you mentioned that GDPR compliance is not necessarily POPI compliance, where do the two differ? And are there things covered in POPI that GDPR doesn't cover and vice versa?
Yeah. So, I mean, in some cases, POPI is actually stricter than GDPR. So one of the differences on the POPI side is that whole thing that we look after company information too. So juristic persons are protected under POPI. That's not the case under GDPR. Under GDPR, it's just living, breathing individuals kind of thing. So that's where POPI is a little stricter. GDPR, on the other hand, has different concepts of sub-processors and things like that. So your cloud providers, that's in there. There are different things around cookie notices and how we do that, whereas like in South Africa, it's just a notice, whereas in Europe, you need to have like opt-outs and all sorts of stuff. But there's about probably between 70 and 80% overlap between the two. And there's minimal work to be done on either side to get yourself up to the right level.
That's very interesting. Thank you so much, Ross. I think I speak to everyone when I say we learned heaps. Thank you so much for taking the time and putting it together. And
absolute pleasure.
We will definitely be sharing this online, and I'll grab the resources from you as well. Thank you so much, Ross.
Absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me.
No, it's always awesome. Okay, so let's hand over to Mandla. Mandla, I leave it in your capable hands to tell us all about Rust and why you love Rust so much, because I think there's some debate within Dariel as well around different technologies. So I'm putting you in the hot seat. Enjoy.
Thank you, Annie. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. Okay, I'm going to share the whole screen. And then please let me know when you can see it.
Yes, all good. We can see.
Awesome.
Nice.
Okay. So this is my talk. Let's make it full screen. I am Mandla. I'm from Dariel. This is my talk. There's the title there. I work with JavaScript, so I'm not scared of long titles. That's my website. I'm gonna put the talk on this page later on GitLab/Luna Mystery. It's gonna be a PDF and the HTML slides when you want them. And this is not working. Why? Okay. Next, about me. So I love Python. And day to day, I write Rust. I write JavaScript and Java, but I've also been learning Haskell for a bit, which I've paused on because I decided I want to learn some Rust. And from the Rust website, this Rust is a language for empowering everyone to build reliable and efficient software. It is a performant language. This is talking about it can run on like Raspberry Pis to servers, and it's got like great memory management. If you've heard about Rust, you've heard about those. It's reliable. It emphasizes safe code, and it's productive. This is talking about things like the Rust analyzer, which are like really, really cool. Allows you to use Rust in like Vim, Emacs, and I don't know what else people use. Now, what I like about Rust, though, this is the list. I sort of had to like squish it down, and I chose these 5 things. Firstly, it's from Mozilla. It's got a lot of books. They use a lot of RFCs. You can create like a single binary for your Rust deployments. And I want to talk about their object-oriented programming story. But first, this is a email that I got from Mozilla. You can see my name down there. And I think this might be interesting to some people. It was designed by Graydon Hoare, no relation to the other Hoare. It's from Mozilla. I like Mozilla. I use Mozilla. Then next, I want to just go to books, starting with the Rust website. And this is the Learning Rust website. This is what I started using for Rust. I started off with this over here, which is Rust by example. This is kind of like learn Rust the hard way. It's like you go along and you do exercises. It takes a while. I got impatient and I jumped into the Rust book. It's also cool. I know they're working on, this is the Rust course by the Rust team. And on top of that, there's all these other books like the Cargo book, Rust book, the Rust C book. There's the command line book, WebAssembly book, and my probably going to be favorite is the Rustanomicon, which is like, I like the name. So that's how like you learn Rust. What basically you see is they have like very good documentation. There's lots of choice in terms of documentation. You can decide how you want to learn. You want to go deep into Rust and look at all the things you shouldn't do, or do you want to just stay at the top level and just learn the good parts of Rust? Next, I want to just show crates.io. If it opens, please open. Crates.io, if you write JavaScript, this is kind of like NPM. And I have a bit of a problem that Zoom is blocking my screen here. Cool. So this is, think of it like NPM. And what you can do is, for example, search for a crate. Crate is like what Rust calls their packages. And when you open the crate, you'll see this is like the GitHub README. This is hosted on GitHub, but you also have this thing called doc.rs. And the docs.rs is basically like the standard sort of conventional place where you'll find Rust documentation. And I think it's cool because, like you can always go to doc.rs for any crate. It obviously is going to change depending on the person creating the library, but it's a good thing. Another thing I like about it is you can like view the source from here. You don't have to go to GitHub. You can see how people are writing their code, and you can see there's like lots of documentation for this particular crate. So that's the other part, like crates.io and docs.rs. They're like really cool documentation sites for Rust. Another thing that I'm not going to show now is they have this thing called DevTest. This is for if you want to create your own documentation. They have built-in support for documentation, and I think this is like super cool because I've had arguments with people about documentation. I usually err on the side of test, and this kind of like combines both of them. Python has a similar thing, but I'll show a bit of this hopefully later. Next, I want to just talk about RFCs. RFCs should actually say governance, the governance model that Rust has. I think it's really cool. And I feel like there's lessons that can be learned, even if you're like a corporate, on the way that they do their governance. So you see here, there's like the roadmap. This is where Rust is going to go, current requests for comments. These are like for big changes in the language. And then they have like various teams within the Rust community. So you've got like your core team, you've got your release team, so you know what's coming up, you've got your compiler team. And then another cool piece is these working groups. From the way I understand these, it's like you have a group of people who are experts in their particular field. So take security, for example. These are people who lack security, and they want to make sure that when you're writing Rust, you're writing safe, secure Rust code. I think this is nice. I saw a talk where they were talking about the async functionality that Rust is getting, and like they looked at like C# and like JavaScript, and they just try to get the best of all of those in a pragmatic way. And I think that that's a very cool way of doing it. If you compare it to something like, which this is not a Go talk, so I'm not going to say anything. I should mention though that there is also a Rust Foundation. And there's like all these pretty logos down here that some people find comforting. So kind of probably means it's going to be around for a while. It's being used actively by those people. So that's RFCs and the governance of Rust. It's cool. And then next, I'm just going to get into code now. This is talking about the single binary that Rust allows you to have. And the advantages of a single binary is that you can have easier deployments. I can compile my binary from this computer and run it on my Raspberry. Probably not, because that Raspberry Pi is a different architecture, but single binaries are good. And Rust, the way you create them is also very interesting. The way you create them uses the Rust compiler. There's also the borrow checker in there. I'm not going to go into that because I don't fully understand it. I'm going to talk about what I like, what I love about Rust, which is it's got really friendly error messages and linting built in. And to do this, I'm just going to point to, this is called Playground Rust. This is the Rust Playground. And I'm just going to quickly close, just minimize this. And this is a pre-prepared code just to show some of the features of the Rust compiler. So I'm going to do tests, and I'm going to start at the bottom here. So this is just the main file. Hopefully this is like really basic. And I'm going to say I'm a JavaScript developer, so I can write like a string and assign it to that thing. It should work, right? If I run the test there, takes a while because I don't have Rust running on this particular machine. And come on. Yeah, you get it. So you see here, it points me exactly to the line that's broken. It tells me we expected a number, you gave us a string, we're not going to continue. And if you still don't understand what this means, there's things like this. This is Rust C is the Rust compiler. You can say, Rust compiler, please explain what this error means. And when you run this command, again, I can't run it because I'm on the playground. It kind of explains in more detail what the particular error you got is about. And I think that like really, really cool. Now let's fix that error. The other thing to notice is I didn't specify the types over here. It knows that this is a number. So why should I tell it that it's a number when it can see that it's a number, it's got type inference. This is very cool. Apparently Java is really struggling to get this, but it's coming for Java 2 one day. I don't know the details on that. The next thing I want to show is I've got tests in the main file. So this is like, if you're in Python, this would be like underscore standard main or whatever. So I've got my test right in my file. This is like, it's not in a separate file. I like this. So this is testing an internal implementation. This is the function up here. All it does is just adds 2 numbers. And if I run this particular one, it should pass because 2 plus 2 is 4, right? Come on, faster. 2 plus 2 is 4. So I get the tests are passing. There's one test passing there and one test passing there. I realized that I broke something. That was supposed to do a different effect there. The other part is what you'll notice is there's 2 tests here. There's this first one that says test internal, and then there's this other one. I'm not sure why it says lib.rs, but what this one is, this is the interesting one that I said when I was talking about documentation. When you look here in this comment over here, so that's just like a comment. This is what this function does. And then I have an example. And in this example, I'm actually using the code that I'm writing. So I'm saying if I add 2 to a number, so if I change this, for example, to, if I add 2 to 3, it's going to be 6. This is going to fail the second test. And hopefully you get what this is. This is like, I can have tested examples in my documentation. This is that like merging of testing and documentation into one thing, and you have like tested, and you can quickly see how your test goes. You can document for the developers or for your 6-month-old self that this is how you were thinking about to use this particular function. It works really great, especially if you have like pure functions. Another part that I want to talk about is this warning that I get over here, which says there's one warning and it's pointing to main and it's telling me that dead code is enabled by default. This is the linting that I mentioned. And linting is sort of, there's also this one up here, which says, please warn me if I have missing documents. I can also, so over here, but the reason this is happening is because this particular function main is not being used because this is not the main module. And to get rid of it, I just say, just allow me to have dead code. Sorry, I can't type. Just allow me to have dead code. And if I run this again, I should have the one test failure because I added a 6 there, but the warning should go away. So I have built-in linting. In JavaScript, you have to install ESLint or Prettier or Black in Python. I think this is really cool. This is taking a while, so I'm just going to leave it. Basically, that's that. All of this, if you're running on your local machine, you will do it through Cargo. Cargo is kind of like NPM or Maven, Gradle in Java, or Poetry in Python. It's what people in Rust use. It's from the Rust team. And another really cool thing is, for example, if you have a library that you want to expose via some API and you want to have like a CLI that you want to use to, I don't know, seed your database. And you have some Swagger documentation that you want to expose on a website, you can group all of those into one thing and call it a crate. And as I said, crates are like packages for Rust. I think this is super cool. And I've tried to do this before. So that's tools. The Rust tools, there's a lot more. I mentioned the Rust analyzer before, which is like integrating into your editor and giving you like auto-completion and formatting and all of those kinds of things as you type to make you more productive. Next, I want to talk about the object-oriented story for Rust. And the object-oriented story I want to talk about specifically is the one that arose from when people were like, global state is bad and we should just break it down into like smaller pieces that we can just spread all over the place and have those objects talk to each other. That's the one that I want to talk about. And that's where, when you compare that kind of object orientation to the functional model of state management, I prefer the functional state management. Rust, on the other hand, doesn't care. With that said, I still want to pick on Java a bit. The way I want to pick on Java is I want to look at the class on Java. So if you've written, so these are two, this is a file, hypothetical Java class. I'm using an interface over here. It's runnable, and you have to implement the run function. It's named sysrunnable, and it implements the runnable. It's got some internal state over there. There's the main function, which is static, and it has some behavior. You can then have the function that you have to implement for the class. And you'll notice it also has to be in the same file that's named as the class. So what you have in here, you have multiple things that Rust sort of learned from the history of all these languages and said, let's just break these up. So what I'm going to show now in a different window is, this is an equivalent, not exactly the same, but kind of equivalent of what you see in the Java side. You have here, it's a module. So when you group something, so this is one way I know that a Java developer is trying to write JavaScript, is when they try to use a class as a namespace or a module, not knowing that in JavaScript you can have top level functions. It's fine, just do it. If you don't have internal state, just do it. So you can have modules, and modules are much more powerful than what I'm showing here. You can have modules inside files, multiple modules in one file, modules inside modules. I don't fully understand it yet, but it looks really cool. You can have this thing called a trait. PHP also has this. I don't know if they're related, but a trait is almost similar to an interface, but I'll talk about it in a bit. And then what Rust does is it separates out the state from, so this is my state, and then down here, this is the implementation of the behavior of that state. So you can still have sort of a class when you combine these two. It's not something that seems to be popular in the Rust community. They seem to prefer implementing traits. This is what's it called, inheritance for behavior, not inheritance for reuse. So that's what you're basically getting here. But the Rust one has something really cool. This is over here. I have a Boolean, and I have my Boolean implementing runnable. The Boolean is a primitive. So over here, this is a Boolean. It's a primitive. It comes from Rust. But I can say all Booleans should be able to run. And the Rust traits mechanism allows you to do that. So when you're starting off, you can think of traits as interfaces, but I think as you go on, you realize there's so much more powerful. Apparently, it also enables you to have iterators that you can then use with for loops, and I'm looking forward to playing around with that. But that's basically the Rust way. They separate out things that in Java or maybe C# you would have in class. They sort of break those out and say, you should think about this separately because they are not actually the same idea. And that gives you a bit more power and control over your code. Going back to the presentation, I also want to just talk briefly about the functional side. I haven't explored it as much, but I've seen something like a box. They have this thing called a box, and it really, really looks like a monad to me. If you've done functional programming, you might understand it. I'm still trying to understand monads, but they have, I think they have like boxes. They have higher order functions. This is, you can pass functions around as if they are primitives. You can pass them into functions, out of functions, return them from functions. It's really cool. They have iterators. If you've seen Java streaming API, you would love iterators. They are really cool. I think, yeah, I love iterators. And then the last part is the academic research. So the little that I've done with functional, it seems to attract a whole lot of academic kind of people. And I don't mean like people who are doing like computer science, who are doing like data science. These are people who investigate types and type theory. How do you have more reliable software? And those, one of the things that I saw with research is dependent types, which sounds really, really cool. This is the idea, from what I understand it, you can have a vector that is exactly 105, can only contain 105 things, and you can put that in your type, and then your compiler can help you realize that, oh wait, over there, you have the possibility of a vector that's not that. And I think that's what dependent types give you. And this is kind of the thing that when you're embracing functional, it sort of brings into Rust. So the type system of Rust is apparently inspired by Haskell, which it's got all these academic people who like working on it. So I like that. I look forward to investigating that. And yeah, that's it. These are the things that I love about Rust. It's from Mozilla. They send me emails. It has great documentation. The governance model is community driven, which I think is really cool. The tooling is amazing, and it's a multi-paradigm programming language. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Mandla. That was awesome. I mean, so many little spicy comments. I love it. We have two questions. The first one is from Jason. It says, is Rust a compiled language, or is it a scripting language where it compiles as it goes? Ah, Mandla, you are on mute. Sorry.
Sorry,
Okay.
sorry about that. So Rust is very much a compiled language. It came from the world of C++. So you'll hear people calling it a systems language. I feel that's unfair because it's a general programming language. You can do a whole lot of stuff with it. It was designed by, I can't find his name now, Graydon Hall. And he worked a lot with C++. And for Mozilla, if you've seen the new redesign that Firefox got for, they're using the servo, can't remember what it's called. That's written in Rust, and they tried to do that in C++, which is a compiled language with like strong types, and it's a foot gun. They decided to create Rust because of the pains they were feeling from C++. So Rust can go all the way from your Raspberry Pi all the way up to servers running in AWS. It's like multi-paradigm.
That's super interesting. Thank you. And then Ewald asks, firstly, he says, great talk, Mandla. Has learning Rust changed the way that you approach other programming languages like JavaScript during your day job?
Yeah, definitely. This is one of the things I try to do. It was during university. I read a book called The Pragmatic Programmer, and in there they recommend you should try to learn different languages to sort of change your perspective on your the way you program. So, for example, what I was showing with the different way that Rust approaches its classes. When now you are coming into, I've had this argument before where I have used a private class within a another class, and people are like, no, that's too confusing. But it's an option that you have within your language, and sort of learning different languages, and you come back to the language that you're working with, it gives you a different perspective to understand how to better use the language that you're working with. So yes, it definitely has improved my programming in other languages.
That's awesome. I think it's kind of like removing the blinders and starting to be aware of the environment that you're around and to start seeing what's good and what potentially could be good otherwise. So yes. Thank you so much. Mandla, we learned so much. It was awesome. Thank you for the demos and for typing on a screen. I actually can't do that when people are watching, so very impressive. Had a lot of fun. Thank you. Thank you everyone for joining us. We are going to be wrapping up our session. I will be releasing the video quite shortly, but otherwise, please take care out there. Stay safe. And again, thank you so much, Mandla. Thank you so much, Ross. This was great fun. And I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.